On this episode, a husband and stepfather is brutally murdered after a family outing, a tri-state manhunt for the killer, and an alert detective notices a discrepancy in the surviving family member's story. From October of 1956 on this episode of True Crimes of the Atomic Age. The 1950s is a time rightfully lauded as an era of family values. It was also a time of social change, both within American society and in pop culture, both of which resonate today. However, human nature is a constant for any time period, and the 1950s, being occupied by human beings, was concerned with the same social ills that have plagued humanity since the beginning of our existence. These were issues of poverty, social unrest, political instability and agendas, and crime. To deny that violent crime was a concern of 1950s society, to downplay or even state that such incidents did not exist or were supposedly unimportant, is to deny ourselves our ability to learn about our shared humanity and to hopefully reduce or even prevent such acts from occurring again. For both the highest aspirations of human kindness and the worst examples of the dark side of human nature have always existed side by side throughout humankind's existence. It is true today, and it was also true during the good old days of the post-World War II era of the late 1940s through the early 1960s, and during the actual decade between those two, that was the golden age of America. To leave out the bad parts of history is to actually dismiss the concerns that society of the past held, or to learn from the lessons that they left us. It is with this spirit that we present this series, True Crimes of the Atomic Age, the 1950s. The 1950s and early 1960s housewife and mother, devoted, caring, always there to selflessly support her children and her husband, all while keeping house and looking perfect.
Don't be silly. The man at the store says he sells a lot of them.
There must be a lot of mothers teaching their sons how to fight.
Get into position.
The trope is a staple of many a 1950s and early 1960s TV sitcom. Barbara Billingsley's June Cleaver, Jane Wyatt as Margaret Anderson in Father Knows Best, Donna Reed as Donna Stone in her self-titled sitcom, and Harriet Nelson playing a fictional version of herself on The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. The trope is so iconic that often these fictional characters are used as examples of what real-life 1950s motherhood was all about. An unbiased look at motherhood would show that most typical mothers of any time period, generally at least, try to have their families, particularly their children's, best interests at heart. A mother's love and devotion is what has enabled the human species, and for that matter, most mammalian and bird species, to survive as long as they have. Some would argue that it's hardwired and biological, the mother bear aggressively attacking anything that comes within close proximity of her cubs, being an example from nature. And if we're to keep our focus on the 1950s decade and human beings, arguably the most famous example of a devoted real-life mother and child bond would be that of Gladys Presley to her beloved son, rock and roll icon Elvis Presley. Still, as with anything, there are always exceptions. If the fictional June Cleaver is the ideal post-war atomic age mother, then Angela Lansbury's manipulative and even incestuous Eleanor Shaw from 1962's The Manchurian Candidate would be her exact opposite in the popular fiction of the time. Then, of course, There's the unhealthy relationship between Anthony Perkins, Norman Bates' character, and his mother, murdered off-screen and replaced in drag by the lead character in Hitchcock's iconic 1960 adaptation of Robert Bloch's 1959 novel Psycho, itself based on the life and infamous murders committed by Ed Gein, who in real life had a dysfunctional relationship with his own mother.
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
The deviancy of these fictional characters were always presented as the exception on screen, and they all shared one thing in common. They were presented as selfish, manipulative, and they put their own emotional interests so far ahead of their own children that it even endangered them. As for the real post-war atomic age, news items and court documents, then as now, gave examples of these exceptions. Women who were so monstrous in their selfishness that their own children were often put in danger. For these individuals, their children were not the focus of love and affection, but were either obstacles, or, in the case of then 35-year-old Gladys Martin, days before Halloween in 1956, a tool to be used. 3 days before Halloween, on October 28, 1956, this real-life horror story unfolded as 32-year-old steelworker Robert Martin, his 15-year-old stepson Anthony Brubaker, Anthony's 12-year-old sister Marianne, and Gladys Martin, 35 years old, were driving back to their Hammond, Indiana trailer home after a visit with relatives in nearby Gary, Indiana. Robert Martin was in the back as his wife Gladys drove before, reportedly, stopping at the intersection of Ridge Road on Indianapolis Boulevard. According to both Gladys and her son Anthony, they had spotted a hitchhiker, a tall, slender man in his 30s, wearing khaki pants and a zipper jacket. Feeling sorry for the man, they allowed him into their car, where this man sat next to Robert, who was resting in the back. Robert had had a bit too much to drink at the family function, which is why Gladys was driving. A bit too much to drink. According to both Gladys and Anthony, the hitchhiker himself also reeked of alcohol, having the smell of whiskey on him, as well as being a bit soft-spoken with what they identified as a southern accent. Anthony and 12-year-old Marianne, again according to Gladys, were seated with her in the front. Marianne was sleeping. Both children were not Robert's, but were Gladys's by her second previous marriage.
Anthony was Robert Martin's stepson from Gladys's previous marriage. She had been married 3 times, and Robert was her third husband. By most accounts, Anthony seems to have been a good student, but he had a record with local Hammond police for being out past the local curfew, but nothing serious beyond that. Anthony Brubaker definitely wasn't a gang member type.
It was third husband Robert, though tipsy from the family gathering in Gary earlier in the day, who had been the one to actually suggest giving a ride to the hitchhiker when Robert, apparently, saw the man flagging them down across from the local Wicker Park swimming pool. Again, according to Gladys. Though Gladys's initial report to the Indiana authorities already seemed to suggest that Robert was somewhat of a habitual drinker, her first reports to the authorities portrayed Robert as a nice drunk. That story, along with many of the details of the telling and retelling of the first story, would change in a few days. In the meantime, according to Gladys, the hitchhiker wanted to go to Calumet, approximately a 10-minute drive further from their own home in the trailer park in Hammond. When Robert, apparently not so drunk as to be able to give the hitchhiker instructions on how to get to Calumet from where they were going to drop him off, told the hitchhiker that they were letting him out, the hitchhiker became agitated, telling them matter-of-factly that he was going where they were going. He then drew a pistol out of his pocket. Gladys stated that both she and her 2 children were terrified. Robert, on the other hand, heroically resisted the hitchhiker-turned-robber, struggling with the man hand to hand before receiving a bullet for his troubles. The man then turned his pistol towards the front seat, instructing Gladys to stop so he could dump Robert's body out of the car. Fearing both for her safety and the safety of her beloved children, she stopped, and as the hitchhiker got out of the car to drag Robert's body out onto the road, Gladys bravely took advantage of the hitchhiker's preoccupation, as well as of his being physically outside of the car, to hit the gas, leaving the hitchhiker and her third husband, Robert, behind them. However, as she was speeding off, she did see that the hitchhiker pumped a few more bullets into Robert's prostrate form. Making it back to their home at the Sheffield trailer park, Gladys called the police. Local Hammond police, concerned about public safety, mobilized quickly. Detective Sergeant Carl Schultz searched for clues where Robert's blood-stained body with 4 bullets to the head was later found. Robert's corpse having been initially discovered by Captain Michael Cambis and Officer Eugene Casper. Schultz had determined that the hitchhiker, whose existence was confirmed by local shop owners and gas station attendants, had made his way into the bush, possibly through Wolf Lake Pond, and perhaps heading towards Chicago, a half-hour away across the state line. For 2 days, state and local police closed down the recently opened Gary-Chicago International Airport, while a tri-state manhunt was coordinated with authorities across Indiana, Illinois, and Michigan. Authorities were so determined to find the hitchhiker that they even set fire to the local underbrush near Wolf Lake in case the hitchhiker was still there, in order to flush him out. Meanwhile, upon repeated questioning, the details of Gladys's story kept changing, with Robert still being alive long enough for Gladys to stop while he and the hitchhiker fought outside of the car before being shot. The ever-changing details aroused the suspicion of another officer assigned to the case, Sergeant Richard Deering. It was he who would, literally, find the holes in Gladys's story, revealing a web of lies, manipulation, and conspiracy to commit murder. October 1956, Around the World in 80 Days, and Cecil B. DeMille's remake of the Ten Commandments enthralled movie-going audiences. Elvis Presley, having just finished a successful and exciting show earlier in the month at the Cotton Bowl at the Texas State Fair, shocked parents and thrilled teenage girls with several appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show. And the news-reading public kept a close eye on the Middle East as a brewing crisis was occurring between Israel and Egypt over control for the Suez Canal. Sharing front-page headlines with the October 29, 1956 Suez Canal crisis was a brutal murder of a local Hammond, Indiana steelworker carried out apparently in front of his own family just after midnight on October 28, 1956. 35-year-old Gladys Martin had blamed the murder of her third husband, 32-year-old Robert Martin, on a hitchhiker whom the family had picked up on the way home to their Hammond, Indiana trailer park after a family gathering in nearby Gary. However, the details of her stories kept changing, and one of the officers who had taken down her story, or stories, Sergeant Richard Deering, decided to inspect the deceased.
Gladys had told the police that Robert was shot while struggling with the hitchhiker. And in the first article, she said that the struggle took place outside of the car. Now she's mentioning and talking about the struggle being inside of the car. And the struggle was over the man's wallet. But no, Robert was actually shot in the back of the head. Powder burns on the back of his head, so that means the gun was pressed to it.
Robert had been shot at close range, and the powder burns in the back of his head contradicted with what Gladys had first related. Working on the case, Sergeant Richard Deering and his partner, Detective Don Vicari, working under Captain Raymond Johnson, decided to search for clues in the Martins' trailer home while questioning the weak link in the family, Gladys's well-mannered, studious, and beloved 16-year-old son, Anthony Brubaker. Deering asked the boy to submit to a lie detector test while repeating his story. Sensing that the boy was keeping a terrible secret, Deering appealed to the boy's sensitive nature, reassuring him that the best thing was for Anthony to tell what really happened. Yes, there actually was a hitchhiker, whom Gladys and Anthony had spotted on their way home from the family gathering while Robert and 12-year-old Mary Ann were sleeping. Gladys had decided that this stranger, whose name is now lost to history, would take the fall in a plan that was weeks in the making. The plan, which even 12-year-old Mary Ann was aware of, was for 16-year-old Anthony, the studious and obedient son, to murder his stepfather Robert on orders from Gladys. Anthony was so devoted towards his mother and her wishes that after dragging Robert's body out of the car, he pumped additional bullets into Robert out the Wolf Lake Pond, just to make sure. For her part, Gladys showed her devotion to her son by personally sewing the cloth gun holster which held the murder weapon under Anthony's sport jacket. She even bought identical gloves for her boy, replacing the ones which Tony used during the execution of Robert, and had tossed, along with the gun itself, near Robert's body. Detectives Deering and Vicari had found the replacement gloves during their search of the Martins' trailer home, which matched the originals found near the gun and body. Anthony, ever the cooperative and well-mannered boy, even aided the authorities in wading through the pond while still dressed in his suit to find the items that sealed the fate of he and his mother. 12-year-old Mary Ann had been in the car during the murder and was aware of the plot, but the state decided that due to her age and the influence of Gladys, she was innocent and was made a ward of the state. Because of Tony's age, the press lumped Anthony Brubaker's crime in with the other cases of juvenile delinquency, which was a concern at the time. But Anthony Brubaker wasn't a gang member, nor a criminal out to make a profit, nor did he kill for thrills or enjoyment. He did it for his mother, Gladys, who was the real delinquent. She would get life for the plot after agreeing to a plea bargain, which saved her life, while showing no concern during her sentencing. In fact, during the trial, she seemed to exhibit a casual attitude to the whole affair, engaging in chit-chat with observers, to the bewilderment of those same observers and press in attendance.
Gladys's casual attitude just before the trial started was a turnoff to observers. She treated the whole thing as if it was a tea party, casual, cavalier, giggling, not even keeping in mind that her son was in some serious trouble.
Anthony got 2 to 21 years, with presiding Judge Murray hoping for the boy's education while in prison and his coming out as a responsible citizen. And why did they do it? With absolutely no physical evidence nor prior reports, Gladys now claimed that Robert Martin was an abusive drunk. It was a claim that Martin's parents, whom Gladys had actually met up with 7 hours after the murder to discuss funeral arrangements, vehemently denied. Gladys's late claim of abuse contrasted with another contemporaneous case of a wife charged with the murder of her husband, that of Helene Benson Dorsey, in July of 1957, a few months after Gladys's trial ended. There had been hospital records of injuries sustained by Helene Benson, indicating physical abuse at the hands of her husband, an Air Force captain, who she shot in self-defense. The overwhelming physical evidence of abuse, as well as her emotional state, rightfully garnered sympathy from the courts, and she was released. And unlike Gladys Martin, Helene Benson Dorsey did not attempt to blame an innocent person, the hitchhiker cited by Gladys, for shooting her husband. The strange circumstances of Robert Martin's death garnered Gladys Martin and her son Anthony notoriety in the 1950s press, but curiously, another case of a murderous mother, that of Elizabeth Duncan and her hiring of two Los Angeles career petty criminals to murder her daughter-in-law Olga in 1958 out of a sense of possessive jealousy over her lawyer son Frank Duncan, took the criminal spotlight away from Gladys and her son Anthony, 12-year-old Marianne, and victim third husband Robert, who all faded from collective memory and the historical record. Until now. Still, the dubious legacy of Gladys Martin and her manipulative and horrifying form of so-called parenting should serve as a reminder that there are some individuals who should never be parents. It is true today, and it was true during the carefree, trouble-free, and too often erroneously stated crime-free atomic age of the 1950s. On the next episode of True Crimes of the Atomic Age, two youth gangs in Manhattan go to war with shotguns, firebombs, bayonets, machetes, and switchblade knives over territory, an inflated sense of honor, and possession of girls. Bystanders and gang members alike will lose their lives on the mean streets of New York during the summer of 1959. This isn't the fictional West Side Story, but the real-life gang war between the sportsmen and Forsyth Street boys of August 23, 1959, Lower East Side Story. We hope you found this first episode of our new true crime series to be interesting while providing a more complete look at what concerned 1950s society. If you did find the following episode to be of value, please subscribe to this channel and be notified of our upcoming episodes. We are currently working on a variety of videos, including a brief, infamous list of 1950s true crime cases, which will accompany this series as a sort of teaser. Our Patreon page helps support the channel, and we are a 501c3 California nonprofit. Any Patreon donations and support are tax deductible, and supporters will receive a receipt that they can use for tax purposes. Also, we have included a link for our website in this video description, which has a variety of video interviews as well as visual presentations. Our latest visual presentation compares the movie version of 1950s juvenile delinquency with the real-life cases, which should be of interest to both 1950s culture fans as well as fans of classic cinema. We thank you for taking the time to view our content, and as always, stay safe.